Welcome back to Faith is the Podcast. I am so excited for today's deep dive. It's all about men who manifest God's presence.
Wow.
And honestly, this message from Apostle Arome Osayi really got me thinking. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like the more we understand these deeper aspects of faith,
Yeah.
the more we can grasp the amazing gift that Jesus gave us.
Absolutely.
Salvation.
Yeah.
But before we jump into all of that,
Okay.
I want to quickly thank our sponsor, Business Referred.
Great folks over there.
If you're looking to connect with some awesome local businesses,
Yeah.
you can reach out to them at info@businessreferred.com.
Perfect.
All right, so back to Apostle Osayi.
Okay.
He talks about how the Old Testament,
Yes.
it's like a blueprint, almost like a shadow
Right.
of what we see in the New Testament.
That's so fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like God was giving us this little sneak peek.
Right.
It's like a prophetic dress rehearsal in the Old Testament of what he was going to fully reveal later on.
Mm-hmm.
And grasping that, I mean, it can help us see the New Testament possibilities
Right.
in a whole new light.
Yeah, and he uses a really interesting example to kind of illustrate this whole idea.
Oh, yeah.
The peace offering from the Old Testament.
Okay.
Now, can you maybe refresh our memory a little bit?
Sure. Yeah.
What exactly was a peace offering?
Well, in the Old Testament, the peace offering, it was a way for people to show they wanted peace with God. You know, they would bring this animal sacrifice.
Yeah.
And it was a way of acknowledging, hey, we messed up.
Right.
And seeking reconciliation.
Yeah, that ties in beautifully with Romans 5.1,
Yeah.
where it talks about being justified by faith and having peace with God.
Yes.
It's like that old quarrel,
Right.
that separation is totally gone because of what Jesus did for us.
That's right. We don't have to live with that fear of condemnation anymore.
Yeah.
We can approach God boldly
Yeah.
with confidence
Huh.
because Jesus, he bridged that gap.
That is so powerful.
Isn't it?
It means that we have access to God, which is that's a huge benefit of Jesus' sacrifice.
It's huge.
But here's where it gets interesting, at least for me.
Okay.
What do we do with that access?
Right.
Like, what's the point of having it
Yeah.
if we don't actually use it right?
Right.
And this is where I think the priesthood of the believer really comes in.
You're hitting on a really crucial point there. The access we have, it's a privilege.
Huge.
And it comes directly from sacrifice. The sacrifice of Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
We didn't earn it.
No.
It's a gift.
Right.
I love how the apostle puts it. He says, there's no access without an altar.
Yeah, that phrase, it's really been sticking with me.
Powerful, right?
But I got to admit, when I hear him talk about blood and altars all the time, especially in Leviticus,
Yeah.
it's kind of a lot.
Right.
It almost makes God sound like, well, a butcher.
I can see why you might feel that way.
Yeah.
But think about it. The repetition of blood, I think it's on purpose.
Okay.
It's to emphasize how important this concept is.
Okay.
Every interaction we have with God,
Right.
every blessing we receive, every time we see God working in our lives, it all comes from the altar, from sacrifice.
So it's not about being morbid
No.
or fixated on the blood itself.
No, not at all.
It's about recognizing the price that was paid to give us this access
I got it.
to God.
It's about the foundation of our faith,
Yeah.
the power of what Jesus did for us.
Yeah.
And that should change how we approach God.
That's so good. So good. It's like we've suddenly been given a key to this amazing treasure room.
That's a great way to put it.
But what are we going to do with it? Are we just going to stand outside and admire the door? Or are we going to step inside and see what's waiting for us?
That's the question, isn't it? It's not about sitting back passively.
Right.
It's about actively engaging with God, stepping into that room.
Yeah. Becoming a conduit for his power.
Exactly. We're not just spectators in all of this.
Right.
We're participants.
Yeah.
We have a role to play, and that role, it's directly tied to that access we have.
And figuring out how to use that access, what to do with it, and that's what makes this so exciting.
I know. It's a journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We covered so much in this first part of our deep dive.
I know. It's amazing.
We went from Old Testament shadows to the peace offering.
Right.
And now we're talking about the priesthood of the believer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about that access we have to God because of Jesus.
And it all ties together. It's beautiful. The biggest thing for me is that understanding sacrifice. And especially Jesus' sacrifice, it shows us how important our relationship with God is.
Absolutely. It's not just about blessings for ourselves.
Yeah.
It's about being used by God to impact the world.
Yes, exactly. And that is what we'll keep exploring in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back, everyone. You know, I'm still thinking about that no access without an altar thing.
Yeah, it's powerful.
What comes to mind for you when you hear that?
It really drives home the point. I mean, we can't just expect to waltz into God's presence
Right.
and get what we want.
Yeah.
You know, there's a cost. There was a sacrifice
Yeah.
that made that access possible.
Yeah, it is humbling.
Yeah.
So if we have this access because of sacrifice, what does that altar business look like,
Right.
in our lives today?
Yeah.
Obviously, we're not bringing animal sacrifices.
No, not anymore. We're not in the Old Testament.
Right.
But the principle is still the same. So instead of those physical sacrifices,
Yeah.
we offer ourselves,
Oh, darn.
our time, our talents, our resources,
Okay.
living sacrifices.
So like our prayer,
Yes.
our worship,
Yeah,
serving others,
Yes.
studying the Bible. That's all like
absolutely.
altar business in a way.
Every time we put God first,
Mm.
every time we surrender what we want,
Yeah.
seek his will, it's an act of sacrifice. It's like we're saying, God, I'm here. I'm yours. Use me.
That's so good.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, it feels overwhelming sometimes.
Oh, I know.
Like, how do we know
Yeah.
what kind of sacrifice God's looking for?
It's not about like trying to guess what God wants.
Right.
Or racking up points or anything.
Right.
It's about having a heart that wants to surrender.
Yeah.
Being willing to let him lead.
Yeah.
And you know what? It often starts with the little things.
What do you mean the little things? Like what?
Okay, think about it. Maybe it's getting up a few minutes earlier
Okay.
so you can pray,
Mhm.
even if it's just to say, good morning, God, thank you for this day.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's listening to worship music in the car instead of the news.
Okay.
It's those little choices,
Yeah.
Those little sacrifices, they make a big difference.
I like that. It makes it feel like a lot less scary.
Yeah.
But what about like the bigger things? Apostle Osayi talked about how this access that we have to God, it's meant to empower us to bless other people.
Yes.
So how does that fit in with this whole altar business?
That is a great question. When we really get how big, how huge of a sacrifice was made for us,
Yeah.
it should make us want to be a blessing to others.
Mhm.
So serving people, using what we have to help people in need,
Right.
that's powerful altar business right there.
So it's like we're taking that peace,
Yes.
that access that we've received
Mm-hmm.
from God,
Yeah,
and we're kind of like pushing it outward.
exactly. We become like these conduits of God's grace
Yeah.
and his love, for everyone around us. And I think that's how we really start to live out what it means to be a child of God.
This has been so good.
Hasn't it?
We've gone from understanding how the Old Testament, points to the New Testament
Yeah.
to unpacking the peace offering.
Right.
And now we're seeing how it all connects to the priesthood of the believer
Mm-hmm.
and what it means to engage in this altar business.
In our everyday life.
Yeah.
I mean, as we keep going,
Yeah.
I hope you keep thinking about that question.
Yeah.
What kind of altar business are you going to do?
Yeah.
What are those little everyday sacrifices?
Mhm.
How can you share God's grace
Yeah.
to make a difference?
That is such a great question to think about.
Yeah.
And with that, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We hope this has inspired you to think differently about your relationship with God
Yes.
and how you live out your faith.
In a powerful way.
In a powerful way, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Faith is the Podcast. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive.
I know it's gone by so fast.
I know it has. It really has. We've been unpacking some pretty profound ideas, I think. This whole thing about how the Old Testament, acts as a shadow
Right. Like a blueprint.
of the New Testament.
Yes.
And, I think understanding that connection can really unlock a deeper understanding
Oh, for sure.
of our faith.
It's been quite a journey, right?
It has been, yeah.
Exploring the peace offering in the
Mhm.
Old Testament.
Yeah.
And, how that points to the access we have to God.
Right. Through Jesus.
Yes.
And of course, we can't forget that phrase, there's no access without an altar.
Right. Wow.
It makes you think about the foundation of our faith.
Yes,
It
it does.
and the sacrifice that made it all possible.
It's definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I kind of want to switch gears a little bit
Okay, yeah.
and talk about something you said earlier.
Okay.
You said that this altar business can sometimes feel a little overwhelming.
Right. It can.
So, for those of you listening and you're feeling that way, What are some practical things,
Yeah, that's a good question.
that you can do?
Well, I think, the first thing to remember is it's not about striving or trying to earn God's favor.
No, not at all.
It's about, cultivating a heart of surrender
Yes,
and willingness to let him lead.
that's so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's about those small choices we make every day, like,
Yeah.
saying, God, I'm here, I'm yours, use me.
Yeah. So maybe
Yeah.
like setting aside a few minutes each morning
Yes.
just to pray,
Yeah.
even if it's just, good morning, God, thank you for this day.
That's beautiful. That's all it takes.
Yeah.
Or maybe like listening to worship music
Yeah.
on your commute
Right.
instead of the news.
Instead of the news. Yeah, right.
Those small things can really make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. What about serving others?
Oh, yes.
Apostle Osayi talked about how our access to God is supposed to empower us to be a blessing
Yes.
to other people.
That's so key.
Yeah.
Finding ways to serve in our community,
Hmm.
like volunteering,
Yeah.
helping a neighbor.
Right.
Those are all acts of altar business.
It's like we're taking the peace and the access that we've received from God
Yeah.
and extending it outwards.
Exactly. We become conduits of His grace, His love. And the more we do that, I think the more we really get to experience what it means to be a child of God.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
We've been given this incredible gift of access to God.
Yes. Amazing gift.
What will you do with it? What kind of altar business will you conduct in your life? What sacrifices will you make? How will you use your access to bless others and, to draw closer to God? Those are good questions to think about. And thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into faith. We hope you've learned some things.
Yes.
That you feel inspired to step more boldly into your relationship with God.
Absolutely.
And thank you for listening to Faith is the Podcast.